Bonjour et bienvenue.
Good morning and welcome to this session called The Challenges of Environmental Action. Global warming calls for urgent measures, as recently stated by the Vice President of WMO. There were record heat waves in the Antarctic, 18.3 degrees. Currently, there are temperatures of about 50 degrees in Canada. So what should one do to check this process? How can one ramp up? There are all sorts of reports on global warming. We're going to talk about that with our guests. Vandana Shiva is a physicist, and she will be talking about damage owing to intensive farming. We have Patrick Poulenay, CEO of Total Energy, who's going to talk about the strategy of the group. Mark Carney is with us too, remotely, special envoy of the UN for climate change, former governor of the Central Bank of Canada and the UK. We'll be talking with you about the role of the financial sector. And we also have Dita Juul-Jorgensen, in charge of energy at the European Commission, Director General. It's mandatory to wear a mask in the room. Before I sketch out the main points in this discussion, I'd like to refer to Mahmoud, President of Paris Dauphine, who's going to be coordinating this session. You have the floor to take stock of the current situation. Thank you. I'm very pleased to be with you to discuss the challenges of environmental action. Given the time available, I'd like to talk about the context and then action that's already been taken. And I'll ask three questions which you may or may not want to answer. First of all, the context. Two important points. First of all, energy sources have radically changed since the end of the 20th century. And towards the end of the 20th century, priority was given to safety, safe supplies from a geostrategic stance. That was fundamental. Environmental issues were relegated to the sidelines. You had the creation of company wealth and negative externalities that might arise, but they were considered to be totally separate. Now this has been fragmented. Now we have climate change, fine particle pollution, etc., etc. So environmental challenges rank at the top of the agenda. But what about real action? However, this is a major shift that has occurred. Second context, part of the context which I view as important, the economic dimension. If you look at things in detail, limiting the temperature rise to 1.5 or 2 degrees by the end of the century, in accordance with the Paris Agreement, would mean that global CO2 emissions in 2050 would have to revert to the levels in 1950. That is the real issue. But to give you an idea as an economist, world GDP will have been multiplied by 10 between 1950 and 2050, and the world population will have been multiplied by 4. So just imagine the challenge. Of course, the model for creating wealth is very carbon heavy. This is a model that's prevailed for over 2 centuries. So I would put the question in the same terms as yesterday at the session on growth. Is this going to be a transition or a radical transformation, a really radical transformation across the board? But there are some little niches where this might not apply. But look at transport, habitat. In the future, farming and transport are the areas that have made these progress compared with other sectors, the logistical supply chain, value chain, international trade. And there's another major issue, and this is part of the context we must bear in mind. By 2050, there'll be hyper-urbanization in the world. Cities will have 10 million inhabitants on all continents. big cities will grow ever larger, in addition to an increase in inequalities, which is really noteworthy. So COP21 in 2015 launched the basis for international cooperation. There were voluntary pledges which were supposed to be made, including all states. And then you have the Kyoto Protocol, and in the meantime there was the negative impact of the Trump administration, which really troubled all these strategies. Luckily in 2020, despite the pandemic, some progress was made, which is worth underscoring. China set the goal of carbon neutrality by 2060. The EU, and we'll talk about that, strengthened its Green Deal for 2050 and increased targets for 2030. And the new Biden administration, that's also something new, made it possible to bring the US back into the Paris Agreement and aim for carbon neutrality by the middle of the century and foster the development of low-carbon infrastructure. So telecommunications, oil and gas, there are many issues, but many companies have pledged carbon neutrality. That was not on the roadmap just a couple of years ago. We'll see whether these pledges will be believable or not. So there are all these areas of action, and there are limits to such action. To finish, I would like to launch the debate by asking 3 questions. First question, long-term versus short-term. That's a super important question. The momentum I've just described is leading sort of aims at the long term, like in the Paris Agreement, and as confirmed by the Secretary General of the UN, or the draft IPCC report, which was recently leaked. So what is actually going to be done in the really short term? What's going to happen? What are we going to do to ensure that the most advanced countries create a carbon neutral society by the middle of the century? And what are we going to do between now and 2025? That's the real issue for me. How can we really tackle the short term? I've described the model of hyper-carbon development, and you have globalization of all the value chains. That's something that was recently observed because it was highlighted during the pandemic. So what are going to be the rules of the game? Will they change? And what are we going to do to foster the traceability in value chains? And what about carbon tax at borders? That's something that we could use in the short term. And last point to finish. As we emerge from this crisis, can we view it as an opportunity to tackle climate change? These are 3 questions that I hope will fuel the discussion, which I'm sure will be extremely interesting. Thank you. I'd like to react to what you've just said. Vandana Shiva, what should we do by 2025? How can we speed things up? How can we use this crisis as an opportunity? Maybe this is a sort of a dress rehearsal for global cooperation to combat the effects of climate change.
First mistake Western fossil fuel colonizing civilization made was give speed privilege. But time is not separable from space. We talk of it as Deshkal, space-time. Einstein said space and time is one continuum. So I think stop trying to speed up. The lockdown, the COVID has taught us all to slow down. I've been part of the movement on slow food, slow clothing. This is where we are both addressing the issue of unemployment, the issue of waste and pollution, the waste of emission generation. So the wrong chasing of time in this crazy direction of linear, unidirectional, predictable, inevitable flow, that's a colonizing imposition. We know there were always options when we live in the South. We know colonization meant that the future was imposed by the colonizer and our presence was shut down. So So I think decolonization is the project. In order to bring justice, the three questions the moderator asked very quickly. He talked about energy alone, but energy doesn't exist alone. Energy, first of all, energy doesn't exist only as an external input system. In science, we call it exosomatic. There's endosomatic. All my work in ecology shows all living systems work in endosomatic energy. And as Schrödinger, my teacher, quantum theory, said, life, he wrote a book called What is Life? Life has negative entropy. What is entropy? Wasted energy, wasted pollution. So why do we have climate change? Because we are too dependent on exosomatic energy, and that's the shift we need. Just not another source of more resource intensive, pollution intensive, injustice intensive, theft intensive systems where the privileged North continues to find fake solutions. I've done 3 books in the recent months on the fake solutions to climate change. The real solution to climate change is to remember we are part of the earth, we are not outside. We are living systems in a living world. Number 2, because we are not her masters, and that was colonizing, the ideology of mastery, the ideology of mechanistic reductionism. We need then to live as equal human beings, equal with other species, so get rid of anthropocentrism. Another illusion that has created violence against animals and plants and microbes. The third very, very important issue related to the shift is my quantum thesis was on non-separability and potential in quantum theory. Uncertainty is the principle. I think we should give up this very, very false assumption that this linear growth is going to make more bigger cities. If you have watched what happened in lockdown in India, millions and millions and millions of people became unemployed in the cities. They had to go back to the villages. The challenge is, how do you regenerate livelihoods in the countryside? And that's relevant for Europe, it's relevant for India. But aren't you counting the 3 million deaths? Why do you remove the pandemics from your calculation of inevitable population growth? So I do feel the West has to get out of its linear mechanical mindset and start thinking of circular systems, interactive systems, interrelational systems, and living system science, including living economies. I'm writing a new book. We need to move from an economics of greed to an economics of care. And that is necessary in the short term, and it's necessary in the long term.
I'll now give the floor to Mark Carney, who's also speaking from a distance. We've started to look at the current situation. You said we have to keep our emissions down to what they were in 1950. How can we achieve this feat given demographic growth? It's a great pleasure to be with you, even if I am speaking from a distance.
The first thing I want to say is, as Patrice's paper and the introduction indicated, the crisis has forced a strategic reevaluation. We clearly undervalued resilience, we've downplayed science, we've ignored systemic risks, we can't make the same mistakes. And we need to build on the foundation of the Paris Accord for international cooperation. And we have to recognize as well that despite its many, many strengths, and I'm a huge admirer of what was accomplished in Paris 5.5 years ago, countries did not live up to their plans. And as a consequence, we are on track for more than 3 degrees temperature rise by the end of the century. And moreover, as Mahbub said in his introduction, he underscored the scale of what's required to achieve the 1.5 degree target. Emissions need to fall by 7% per annum over the course of this decade. And we did meet that bar last year, but only because large swaths of the economy were shut down. Now, I don't think that that's something that can be repeated, let alone compounded. In other words, more and more of the economy shut down. And that underscores that we need to invest in order to get to net zero. And the scale of investment This is a fundamental transformation. It's not just a transition, it's a fundamental transition, which is underscored by the scale of investment that's required. More than a doubling of investment in energy infrastructure, orders of magnitude of additional trillions of euros every year in order to get to net zero. Now, I want to say a few comments on the financial sector and what's being done in the financial sector, because there is a transformation that is underway there, and how that brings the future to the present, because I think this focus on what's going to happen in the next 5 years is absolutely correct, and it's the right challenge. The first thing is that we have seen a big movement by countries to commit to net zero. 30% of emissions were covered by net zero commitments at the start of 2020. It is now almost 75% of global emissions under net zero commitments. So there's been true progress there. And then what has happened is that is cascaded down from the country to the company level and very much to the financial sector as well. And I'll get to that in a moment. In order for these plans to be put in place, though, to actually put into action, they need enormous amount of finance. And so the financial sector needs information, it needs tools, and it needs new markets in order to do its job. That starts with fundamental and mandatory climate disclosure, not just of risk today, but risk tomorrow. There's something called the TCFD, which was launched in Paris. It was delivered to the G20 leaders only 3 years ago. Now is the time to make it mandatory. The G7 agreed to make it mandatory a few weeks ago. There's something called the IFRS, which can apply these principles to over 120 countries, and they are going to take them up. The European Union is already led on this, and of course, all of this builds off of France's original leadership back in 2015. So there's a chance here, and it's not just a chance, this will happen, is that the financial sector and broader stakeholders will have the information about companies' climate footprints today, but where they're going tomorrow. Second point, around risk. This is the critical area where we can bring the future to the present and end the tragedy of the horizon. And what's happening is that, building off of work of the Banque de France and the Bank of England, we originally formed with the People's Bank of China, a small group of central banks, less than 5 years ago. It's called the Network for Greening the Financial System. It's now over 90 central banks covering 85% of global emissions. And what those central banks are doing now with the major banks and insurers is stress testing them, bringing that future to the present and asking them the question, the hard question of, if you continue on your current path, what is the scale of exposures and risks and losses you will have under two scenarios, basically. One in which the costs and the physical risks and realities of climate change only continue to mount because we don't do enough. And the other one, which is actually we do do enough. But in that scenario, there's huge amounts of stranded assets, and companies and financial institutions need to prepare for those today. Third point, I mentioned net zero plans for countries, or objectives for countries, increasing plans for companies. What is happening as well is that the financial sector is shifting to commit to net zero. We formed an alliance, the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, many leading European financial institutions at the core of that. The bottom line is that the balance sheets in this alliance total to more than 70 trillion euros. I'll repeat that, 70 trillion euros. That's the size of global GDP. And these commitments are not just, it's not a 2050 commitment, it's a commitment that includes 5-year decarbonization plans and specific sector strategies that need to be released within 18 months, and including annual reporting. So there's the commitment and the action that's brought forward. Last point. We need some major new markets in order to make the global investment that's necessary to decarbonize. One of those markets is for carbon offsets. The final report and the final recommendations for that are going to be released this coming week. Another huge market is for what's called blended finance. So it's bringing together the resources of the multilateral development banks and leveraging that 70 trillion euros of private capital so that there's major investment in emerging and developing economies. And Laura, I should stop there and I'll hand back to you. Thank you.
Merci, Marc.
Thank you very much, Mark Carney. I'd now like to thank you. You are Vice President of Brookshield Asset Management, a Canadian asset management company. Now I'm going to turn to Patrick Pouyanné. We've talked about these companies which are making progress when it comes to combating climate change. Recently, you announced a major change in your strategy. You no longer want to be an oil-based company. No, you all think we are an oil company. We aren't really anymore because that's the energy of the present, and total energy consists in preparing for the future, as Mark Carney has just said. We have made clear pledges. We moved from a model based on hydrocarbon, but 80% of global energy comes from fossil fuel today. The challenge is huge, therefore, because what needs to be done is to provide energy to the planet, but quickly prepare the planet for a carbon-free energy. So what we're doing is the following. We decided to commit to renewable energy. This year we invested $3 billion in renewable energies, mainly wind and solar energy, and we're going to change our company. We're going to adopt a new multiple energy model. There'll be oil, gas, and electricity, biomass, wind energy, hydrogen. We're broadening the spectrum. We're preparing for the future. So it's a real transformation for our company. It's very down to earth too. 2035, 2050, of course, by 2050, we want to be carbon neutral. If you don't say that, you're almost excluded from the market. But what are we going to do in the years to come? Our teams are very responsible. We have clear-cut objectives. By 2030, we'll sell 1/3 less of oil-based products. We're scaling back in terms of our original field of activity, and we want to supply more green electricity. We'll be producing green electricity and selling it and distributing it. We will become a major player in the electricity chain, and also because you have transition energy, which is natural gas, which we can make carbon-free. We can produce hydrogen, biomass. By 2030, we'll have a very different energy mix from now. 1/3 oil, then natural gas, and 20% renewable energies. So that's quite a revolution. We're 55% oil, 45% gas currently. So that calls for heavy investment, because that's what really counts. A quarter of our investment will be earmarked for renewable energies. Half of all our growth will be invested in renewable energies. If I invest 13 billion euros in a given year, half has to be devoted to maintaining the current system, which enables the world economy to work. And then the other half will be for green energy. So this is a real pledge. We'll ramp up 5, 10, 20%. Total energy, we're speeding things up. There's an exponential acceleration in our commitments. And this will have an impact on emissions. Our concrete contribution by 2030 is what? We want to reduce our own emissions. We produce 50 million tons of carbon, and we said we'll cut this by 40% by 2030. That's pretty much compatible with the various roadmaps. And then we made a commitment for Europe. We have the European Green Deal. We're very European. 60% our sales of energy are in Europe. So we said we would reduce emissions by at least 30%. If the Commission adopts the 55% package, as just mentioned, we could revise this to 30-40%. So this is a very strong commitment. We'll clearly sell fewer oil-based products. The Commission in Europe has pledged to make the energy market change, and we're going to follow them. We want to adapt to the new market, energy market. I don't want to go against the market. So we'll decarbonize our energy offer. The carbon intensity of all the products we sell is 20% over the next few years, and that fits in with the general roadmap. We also have to act on demand. You can't just change the way you produce the energy, you have to change the supply, granted, but supply matches demand. And what's really complicated is that we won't change the energy world unless we change the way people use energy. I don't make cars. It's others. I don't make planes. And so we must act on the demand side as well. And we can. We have the means to do so at Total Energy. I spend a lot of time working in this area. I meet with all sorts of CEOs in Europe to see how truck companies, for example, could use clean energy. I think in this manner we'll manage to settle the problem in the next 10 or 15 years. If we want to meet goals by 2050, we have to scale back oil consumption by 30% between now and 2030. We can't starve the planet, give it no energy. We have to achieve a proper transition. So we have the Layer report. We want to aim at 2050, but we also have goals for 2030. We don't have a magic wand. We can't just say we're not going to give you any more fossil fuel energies. We have to achieve a transition towards electricity, for example. Will it be for 2030, 2035? I don't know. Electric cars, the halt in thermal engines will mean people use 30 or 40% less fossil fuels. And if you don't have a strong impact on demand, we won't be able to solve the issue. In terms of what Mark Carney said in the financial sector, this transition has to be inclusive. It's not by exclusion that we'll achieve anything. We need to say to financial players, no longer invest in these companies. No, that doesn't work. On the contrary, you have to attract more capital to achieve the energy transition. It's a tremendous challenge. Renewable energies, that's trillions of dollars that we must invest together to achieve this transition. Look at things in a positive light. You want to avoid exclusion. You need to include, and in our way of working, we have to create a sort of dynamic, positive momentum. For Total Energy, we want to find it's a fine balancing act between investing increasingly in the energies of the future, where the demand isn't necessarily there, and continuing to sell energy so the world can tick. So it wasn't an easy decision to take. We're over 100 years old as a company, but the ambition of people who work for us is to be a leader, to play a really positive role. And we have a huge ability to invest. We have the skills, and our men and women are prepared to forge ahead. So we have to find all these projects. We want to deliver results while upholding the sustainable dimension.
Patrick Pouyanné, you introduced the subject, the Green Deal. Did you, Jorgensen, what are the actions of the European Commission to fight global warming? Thank you, and hello everyone under the rain in Aix. It's quite difficult to be the fourth one to talk. So I might repeat a few things that were said. I'll try and speak in French and avoid to mix French and English, but please forgive me if I'm using English words in my presentation. So this is the transition plan towards climate with zero greenhouse gases by 2050. And the first decade would be a reduction of 5% of greenhouse gases by 2030. It's a very ambitious plan, but it is also an economic plan for green growth throughout Europe and for competitivity, innovation, employment in Europe, not only in the energy sector, but also in technology, green technology. So energy production and consumption represent 75% of greenhouse gas emissions. So we have to change the energy market and have a real energy transition. But we need to do it in the short term because the climate crisis is immediate. It is happening currently. So, of course, we have goals for 2050, but we can't wait. We have to use the solutions and the technology available and also develop new technologies. At the European Commission, we have a working program which is quite dense, so as to reach 55% by 2030, and then climate neutrality in 2050. And then on the 14th of July, we have a batch of initiatives, 20 or 13, to try and reach those goals. Concerning the energy sector, it is essential for an essential tool for change, and we have to follow three axes. First, consumption. Second, energy. Vandana said energy does not exist on its own. If you do not use it or you do not consume it, of course, it's the cleanest energy. So we need energy efficiency and reduce our consumption. Second, we need a higher level of electrification because electric consumption, electric cars compared to combustive engines are much more efficient. So we need renewable energies and low carbon energies such as the nuclear energy, which is very present in France, for instance. And we also need to develop low carbon sources such as hydrogen and to decarbonize gas. Renewable energy is a priority for the European Union because it is the cleanest source of energy, and we are really interested in developing competitivity, innovation, technology in Europe and to create jobs in photovoltaic panels, for instance. So there's an economic interest, but also a climate interest to switch toward renewable energy. Our target is 32% of renewable energy within the European system by 2030, and we'll need to increase the ambition and the target by around 38 to 40%. And of course, this means huge investments to try and reach those goals. Concerning financing and investing, Mr. Carney mentioned it. Of course, we need public investments. In Europe, we have the recovery plan, which is a huge investment at a European level, but also national recovery plans, and all those national plans must reach an investment level for climate of 37%. And several member states, went beyond this 37% and reached 54 to 60%. But investments cannot only be public investments, which is why we have taxonomy. And Patrick, you mentioned that. Taxonomy gives you a way to follow some guidelines for investors or private companies to create some sort of a clear framework for investments and green investments. And finally, last point, other speakers mentioned the fact that the transition needs to be fair. And depending upon the way you organize your transition, the distribution effects are different. We are trying to organize our proposals for 55% in a profitable and fair manner in terms of employment, distribution, and social issues within peoples of Europe. So we are giving financing at a European level to help people who need to work harder to reach their goals. However, on a European or global scale, there are opportunities for employment and competitivities because there are more employment opportunities in the green sector compared to the fossil fuel sectors. Thank you very much. Thanks. Yes, to see how we can articulate those issues, Patrick Pouyanné, did you benefit from the Recovery European Plan? Well, with Stellantis, we wanted to try and create battery for electric cars, so we will receive 1.2 billion from France and Germany. We also presented a hydrogen project to the Commission because it's a fledgling technology, and it will be needed to increase demand because we're trying to increase production costs for hydrogen, but we need to produce massively, and we would need to accelerate demand for hydrogen and not supply because people are not asking for hydrogen. And we also ask for support concerning carbon capture, which is our new technology when the Commission is using incentives and innovations, and I think those are keywords compared to constraints, for instance. I think that we will manage this if innovation and technology is supported, and that's how the European plan is interesting. So might we be ahead concerning those new technology thanks to those green plans? Because some of our sectors are lagging back, such as the digital sector. So we're trying to change, and we thought that this Fit for 55 might be an investment opportunity for us. Because, again, we talk a lot of regulation, but I think our capacity for innovation together will be a deal changer. Of course, we cannot change the way European trucks move around Europe if there are no constraints concerning emissions, of course. Why? Because sectors are looking for cheap energy. We're talking about fair transition, but in terms of energy, energy is an essential good, be it for an individual consumer or an economy. So it has to be cheap, but the transition is costly. We have to invest in this transition. So how can we use regulations and incentives? We need a level playing field. If you have people delivering goods with trucks and using hydrogen, whereas it's more expensive, so that's when we need collective frameworks, because the failing risk might be, in the end, how consumer and clients react if we do not organize the transition and they feel that there are purchasing powers that are changing and that are detrimental to them. This is what we saw in several countries, and this is a risk. I know that scientists tell us you have to transform, but societal reality requires a gradual transition. Because if we had a magic wand, we might create revolution and go backward as we experienced it in France with a carbon tax. Vandana Shiva, on the question of, on this specific issue, what do you think about the action of a group such as Total? Do you consider it's a progress, an important step, or is it not enough?
Well, you know, I don't define my world around 100-year-old entities. I define my world around a 4 billion entity called Gaia, the Earth and her living systems. And the Total person said, oh, carbon capture is a new technology. Please come to our Earth University and you will see how in the miracle of a green leaf, nature has billions of years of technology to take the carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere through photosynthesis. The sunshine and the carbon dioxide become the oxygen we breathe, and people died during this COVID pandemic for lack of oxygen. Please wake up to nature's technologies. Men don't make technologies. Men destroy nature's technologies. Men destroy women's technology. And at one level, that is precisely what the Total representative said. But sadly, the person before him, Mike Carney, he said something fascinating. And I feel sad if Europe is going that way, because then it stinks of recolonization. Net zero should mean absolute zero reduction of greenhouse gases, because polluters have been responsible for climate change, and polluters should stop polluting and pay for the past pollution. Net zero is we'll continue to pollute, but you will be locked into offsetting our pollution. He actually said this. We need new markets for carbon offsets. And I would like to tell him with a lot of love and a lot of gentleness, but with a lot of freedom. I am not your offset. I am not your garbage dump. You are an Earth citizen, and you have an obligation to the Earth and future generation to stop polluting and to stop playing financial tricks. The financial world has played too many tricks since we saw the 2008 collapse, since the new financial barons have grown, where wealth is so much bigger than the country's wealth that they control national decisions. So the narrative of carbon has to come back to the living molecule that gives us life. From the hydrocarbons, that was the fossilized carbon, over 600 million years, the Earth put it down and said, leave it there. But every day she gives us plants. We need to think afresh, and I think it's the young people of Europe who need to be leading this discussion, not the very people who gave us the problem. Not the oil companies, not the financial asset management. They gave us the company. And he also talked about, we don't have this technology. Our work in Navdanya, my work on Soil Not Oil, shows that in 10 years, we can pull out all that excess carbon dioxide, all that excess nitrous oxide that has come from synthetic fertilizers, and put it back into the soil and turn it into fertility. But that means work. That means more people in the countryside. We have to stop defining agriculture as a production system. We've started to define it as a regeneration of the earth. Once we do that, we start to do different calculations. We will not assume that trucks must keep moving to bring us junk food that invades into the forests and destroys the Amazon, destroys the rainforests of Indonesia for palm oil, and gives us sickness. This is not a food system. It is killing us. It's killing us through pandemics. 300 new infectious diseases come because of invasions into forests by agribusiness. 75% chronic diseases, from neurodegenerative diseases and cancers and obesity and diabetes and endocrine disruption, come from a bad food system. Please give up your trucks. Look towards your garden. We grow gardens of hope, and 80% of the food we eat comes from small farms. So get real, look at the real world. Who feeds us? The small farms feed us, women feed us, the pollinators feed us, the earthworms feed us. I do believe the really powerful rich men need a class in ecology.
Vandana Shiva. Marc Carnet, puisque Vandana...
Mark Carney, because Vandana talked about your saying, don't we risk having a gap between the northern and the southern country on the question?
Well, first, let me make 3 points. First, I want to underscore something Patrick Pouyanné said, which is about the requirement for investment across all industries and all sectors who are trying to decarbonize. And we need to be a little careful in terms of taxonomies and other approaches which only go to the end state at this stage where we need this investment across the board. It's a broader subject, but I want to make that point. The second point, which is around the fundamental role for absolute emission reduction, without question. That is the core responsibility of companies, it's the core responsibility of financial sector, it's the core responsibility of countries. But we have a very limited carbon budget. If we are going to have any chance of making that, we need to use all resources, including natural carbon offsets, as the professor just mentioned, the carbon offset in the leaf and the growing those offsets in nature-based solutions rapidly, globally, and very much in the emerging and developing world. And what we're talking about is a mechanism in order for that to be the case and to be scaled up. Let's be clear about the scale of investment today in natural carbon offsets. It's less than €1 billion, per annum. It needs to be on the order of magnitude of €100 billion. These are direct transfers from companies who are companies in the advanced world, in the north, shall we say, who are on these transition paths to projects in the emerging and developing world. This can be scaled up very quickly. It is not the solution. To be absolutely clear, I'm mentioning it as one of many things that need to be done. But it is one of the things that needs to be done in order to preserve that carbon budget, to build the time and to ensure that the broader investment is put in place in order to get there. And that is, those are the maths of today.
Patrick Pouyanné, vous voulez...
Maybe juste un mot sur la...
Yes, we know about nature's technology, and Total has invested $100 billion a year. So we are one of the players, and recreating condition. Well, it is a different jobs from mine, and it's a very complex one because investments must create carbon stocks that are sustainable. So we have to work with communities which are locally implanted, and we must work in symbiosis with nature so that those carbon wells are real and exist. And it takes a long time to build projects. It's a very passionate project, and I know that Mark works on the subject. If you want this to happen, it needs to be ethical. There are carbon markets, for instance, and I think that to encourage those investments, we need a framework of data. There is item 6 on COP21 that talk about neutral carbons, and some people are against the idea of organizing such notions, but I think that if we want to be sustainable, we have to commit. Those are the best carbon wells in the world, and in Glasgow, if we could agree to stop deforesting the planet in zero net, which is negative, that would be a big step forward. So I know Mark works on that, and I hope we'll make progress on the Glasgow COP to organize those willing markets. Now, what about the carbon tax at the border of the Union? Are you in favor? Yes, I am, but I'll leave Dieter the floor. It's a question of justice for Europeans. If we are ahead, we mustn't pay for the others. But some other countries are moving forward, and I think it's a very complex subject. I'll leave the floor to Dieter. Yes, it's very important questions. And this is what we are striving to do for climate neutrality. It is not a legal measure. It is not an economic measure. But the thing is that Europe represents only 9 to 10% of greenhouse gases on a global level. So we can reduce those emissions, but we won't reach 1.5 to 2% if there's no global effort. So we must make sure that the carbon market that we created in Europe does not create some sort of a leakage so that the production of emissions does not move somewhere else on the world, which is why we will implement a measure of frontier carbon so as to avoid such leakages. And we hope that it will be an opportunity for the countries to commit and have committed action on regional or global markets. Can I come back briefly on the question of nature technology? Because I think that Vandana Shiva raised very important questions. In Europe, we have a bioeconomy. I don't know whether this is French or not, but I'm trying. A bioeconomy that developed maybe too quickly without the proper balance, because we need a balance between bioenergy, biodiversity, and carbon sinks, because we won't reach our goals in 2030 and 2050 if we do not create nature's technology. So an important part of the plan that we'll be launching on July 14th is a strategy for forests in Europe, so as to create a balance between economy, energy, biodiversity, and carbon sinks, which represent forests. So natural technologies are the most efficient and the most profitable, and we have to integrate them more efficiently in the strategy we're trying to set out. We have a few minutes. Are there questions in the room? Yes, the lady with the green mask. Hello. Thank you for this panel and those conversations. I wish to talk about what Mrs. Shiva said. You're talking about sustainability, and there's no one of my generation to speak. And sometimes it's difficult to trust you, because we know that the climate law that was voted by the European Union is not ambitious enough compared to the Paris Agreement. There are many associations that said this was not enough. So how can we keep trusting you, industrials or people of power, to save our future? Because we will pay the price. If Total is transforming into Total Energy, it's because of young people and Greta Thunberg, for instance. I have 4 kids, and we have complex debates at home on the subject. So it is clear that today you are telling us that our generation does not feel accountable, but you can see that we're moving. There's an evolution. There's a global awareness. Yes, of course, it's recent. Kyoto happened 2 years ago, but Paris accelerated the process. So I understand you might not trust us or be doubtful, but in the change of our companies, there is a will to show that we understand and we wish to change. But I expect from you to commit and to commit with us to build this world for the future, because we have to work together, and if we fight, we won't make it. So we are really sincere, although the system is complex and we do not have a magic wand. Dieter Jürgensen, I'll leave you the last word because we only have a few minutes left. First, we need you. And I'm not saying it's your responsibility, it is ours. We have to change our regulations, our investments, but we need the pressure you exert on us, because the European Green Deal is based upon a very clear election for the European Parliament. And the mandate was to act against climate change and to fight it. So we need your pressure to be on the right way for 2050. I hope that this partnership might take place, in fact. How old are you, miss? And that would... I'm slightly old. I'm 25, in fact. All right. Well, thank you, and thank you all speakers, Vandana Shiva, Marc Carnet, Patrick Pouyanné, Diteliu Lorgensen, et Mohud. Thank you all. And